serviced transit pods in the lower hub of the Anvil Spire for going on 19 years. And in all that time, nobody ever told me to keep quiet while I worked. Maybe somebody should have. Maybe if a supervisor had pulled me aside my first week and said, "Callow, when you're in Bay 6 you don't say a word," things would have gone different. But nobody did. So I talked the way I always talk. To the tools, to the recycler housing, to nobody in particular. And that's how it started. Bay 6 was the Lady Yvelle's pod. I knew that the way everyone in the hub knew it, by the hush that fell over the bay whenever the lift brought it down, and by the two attendants who walked ahead of it with their hands folded, not looking at anything. The pod itself was a long crystal-paned capsule, sealed tight, climate-regulated, soft blue light inside. She rode in it everywhere. To the upper court, to the gardens, to wherever a Calais princess needed to be. Because of the hush. I never got the medical version of it, not really. What I got from the supervisor who walked me through Bay 6 on my first day there was this. The Lady Yvelle's nerves ran too close to the surface. Sound, voices, even being looked at straight on. It all came at her too loud, too bright. Put her into what they called an episode. So for 11 years the court's answer had been quiet. Total quiet. Nobody addressed her. Nobody met her eyes. If you had to mention her at all, you did it the way you'd mention the weather. To the room, about her, never to her. I'd been doing the recycler service on that pod every Tuesday morning for 2 months before I ever broke that rule. And I didn't break it on purpose. I was on my back under the housing, fighting a cartridge seal that had swollen tight in its collar, and I was losing. "Come on, you stubborn," I said, and gave it another half-turn, and it gave, all at once, the way they do, and I banged my knuckles on the frame and said something a lot less polite than that. I heard a sound from inside the pod. Small. Almost nothing. I looked up, and through the crystal pane I could see her. Pale lavender skin, hair the white silver of frost on a window, eyes a soft glowing violet, sitting very still in a long gray traveling robe with her hands folded the same way her attendants folded theirs. She wasn't looking at me, but the corner of her mouth had moved. The attendant by the door went rigid. I didn't know yet that I'd done anything. I just wiped my hand on my coveralls, looked at the pod and said, "Mornin', sorry about the language." Nothing happened. No alarm, no episode. Nothing the way they'd described it to me. The attendant's face went through about 4 different colors and then settled on pale. The Lady Yvelle sat exactly as she had, hands folded, eyes forward. But her readings, there was a little display panel built into the pod's side, the kind I checked every week as part of the recycler service. Heart rate and breath rate and some kind of nerve response line that usually sat, jagged and tight. That line went smoother than I'd ever seen it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I finished the seal, logged the cartridge change, and went on to Bay 9. But I came back the next Tuesday and the Tuesday after that, and I kept talking. Not to her, exactly, or not only to her. I talked the way I always did about the weather in the upper concourse, about a coupling on a freight hauler that had taken me 3 hours longer than it should have, about my daughter's exams, about nothing. I'd ask the recycler housing if it was going to behave today. I'd ask the pod's display panel if that reading looked as off to it as it did to me, and sometimes, without really deciding to, I'd ask her. "You'd know better than me," I told her one morning, holding up a valve gasket that had worn paper thin. "You've been sitting 2 feet from this thing longer than I have. Does that look right to you?" She didn't answer. Not that week. But the line on the display stayed smooth the whole 40 minutes I was in the bay, and when I packed up my kit, I caught, just for a second, her eyes following the gasket as I dropped it in the scrap bin. It went on like that for weeks. Small things. I'd describe what I was doing as I did it, the way you might to a coworker leaning against the next bench. I'd hold tools up for her opinion and not wait for one. I told her, flat out one Tuesday, that the new cartridges they'd given me were cheaper than the old ones, and I didn't think much of them. For a long moment, I thought I heard, under the hum of the recycler, something that might have been a laugh, quick and startled, like she hadn't expected to make the sound, and didn't quite know what to do with it once it was out. The healers started noticing the readings before anyone noticed me. 11 years of careful management had kept her nerve response line within a narrow, anxious band. Calm, but the kind of calm that takes constant tending, like a level kept level by a dozen small adjustments. Tuesday mornings, for the 40 minutes I was in base C6, that line went flatter and steadier than it ever did the rest of the week. Nobody could explain it. The magistrate healer, a tall, gray-faced woman named Orsa Venn, came down twice to watch the service herself, standing well back, arms folded, saying nothing, and both times the readings did exactly what they did every Tuesday, smooth as still water. Shh. While I complained about cheap cartridges, and asked a girl in a glass box whether she thought I should re-torque the housing bolts in a different pattern this time. The day it really changed, I'd brought the wrong size driver and had to improvise with a multi-tool, and the head of it slipped and clattered off the housing onto the deck plate, loud, right by the pod. I winced, more for my knuckles than anything, and said, sorry, didn't mean to. And the Lady of L laughed, not the startled half-breath from before. A real laugh, surprised out of her, both hands coming up to her mouth like she could catch it back, and then, just as fast, her eyes filled and she was crying. Not the rigid, controlled stillness the attendants were trained to manage. Real tears, her shoulders shaking. 11 years of something coming loose all at once in a maintenance bay over a dropped tool. The attendant by the door went for the panel. The protocol was clear. An episode meant eat isolation, dim the lights, clear the bay, seal the pod. I heard him start the sequence and I just kept talking. I picked the driver back up off the deck and I said, yeah, I do that about twice a shift. Drives my supervisor up the wall. You're all right, happens to everybody. I don't know if it was the words. Probably it wasn't. But she looked at me, really looked, for the first time in 2 months, straight on, the way the protocol said, nobody was ever to be looked at and nobody was ever to look back. And the readings on the display, instead of spiking the way 11 years of episodes had taught everyone to expect, came down. Slow but down. By the time the attendant had the isolation sequence half-armed, she was just sitting there, wet-faced, breathing, looking at a man on his knees with a dropped multi-tool. And the line on the panel was the steadiest it had been all 11 years. Magistrate Healer Venn called off the isolation herself. She didn't say much to me that day. Just stood in the doorway a long moment, looking at the readings, looking at the Lady Vel, looking at me. How long? She asked finally. Have you been talking to her? Couple months, I said. Didn't think it was against the rules? Nobody told me different. No, she said. I don't suppose anyone did. Nothing was announced. There was no ceremony, no plaque, nothing for the record that I ever saw. But the Tuesday recycler service on Base 6 stayed on my schedule. Permanently, the work order said, no end date. And the attendants stopped folding their hands quite so tight when I came through, stopped walking ahead with their eyes on the floor, and the Lady of L started answering. Not every week, not much, a word here, a nod. Once a whole sentence about the cartridges that made me laugh out loud and got me a look from the attendant that I chose not to interpret. Still don't know the real medical name for the ashush, or what 11 years of careful silence was actually meant to prevent. I only know that for 2 months, I did my job the way I'd always done it, talking to my tools and the housing and the air, and somewhere in there, I started talking to her too, the same way, because that's just how I talk, and it turned out that was the thing nobody else thought to try. Every Tuesday now, before I start on the recycler, I say the same thing I said that first morning, minus the language. Mornin'. And every Tuesday now, she says it back.